Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. My name is Eric Johnston. I'm the Senior National Correspondent for the Japan Times, and it's a pleasure to be here. Welcome to the Cross-Cultural Forum, sponsored by Sapporo University and the Hokkaido International School. Today, we're going to talk about Getting Started, a guide for students seeking a professional journalism career. I don't know how many of you out there are thinking about a career in either journalism or media. There have been many changes over just the past few years, and today journalism is both more exciting and in some ways more difficult to enter. Perhaps you're not to the point yet where you're seriously considering a career in journalism or public relations or communications or media, but I hope that this presentation will give you some basic ideas so that if you do decide to pursue a career as a journalist, you'll have some idea as to how to get started. Let me just start off by saying a few words about myself. I'm an American, and I've been living in Japan for 34 years, all of it in the Kansai region, living in Kyoto and Nara, and working in Osaka. I travel around the country on reports and assignments, and I've been to 46 of Japan's 47 prefectures. Currently, I'm here in Hokkaido covering the opposition parties for the October 31st general election, and I traveled to Sutsu, the very small village in far western Hokkaido the other day, to do a report on the proposed long-term nuclear storage waste facility. So I'm happy to be here today, and I'm happy to share with you my experiences as a more than 3-decade journalist, and especially as a journalist working in the English language here in Japan. So let's get started, shall we? First of all, we need to start off by clarifying what we mean by the word journalist or journalism. Working in journalism as opposed to working in media. We all have friends who say, oh, I'm working in the media, or I want to work in the media. But there are very important differences that we need to mention at the beginning. First of all, journalism is defined as observing, interviewing, researching events, and presenting them in a story that has a beginning, a middle, and an end. Whereas media is the technology, whether it's old-fashioned paper or analog radio or digital broadcasting in cyberspace. But it's the technology through which journalism, the stories, are told. So it's important to keep those differences in mind. And the easiest way to understand the differences is to recognize that all journalists work in the media, but actually very few people in media are working journalists. So what is a journalist and who is a journalist? There are many definitions. You can look in the dictionary, you can talk to your professors, you can read books and find out what other people say as a journalist, but let me offer you my definition. Basically, I've divided journalists into 5 different categories: full-time news reporters, full-time features writers and editors, freelance reporters, editors, people who write books, and self-employed publishers. In the case of a full-time reporter news editor, we're talking about someone who works full-time for one media organization only, and they do news stories. Very often, they will file 1, perhaps even 2 or 3 small stories a day on events that are happening. And when we say news, we're talking about political news, economic news, social, cultural, scientific. So it doesn't matter, but they're reporting factual information every day. Then we have features writers and editors. These people write feature stories about daily news reports to provide extra background and extra context. And they usually don't write every day, but they'll spend a few days researching one topic and then write a long story about it. They might be a specialist in one area. You have features writers who are political specialists, who are specialists in the environment, health issues, technology, culture, whether it's anime or traditional Japanese culture or other forms of culture. They have spent long years researching their subject and they know it very well. and so that's why they are hired to write feature stories about it. Then there is a freelance reporter or a freelance editor. Basically, there are two types. The first type covers a wide variety of topics for a wide variety of media organizations. A typical day in the schedule of a freelance journalist might start off in the morning writing a story for an automobile magazine about the newest Toyota or Honda cars. Then in the afternoon, they may have another assignment writing about the food of Susukino. Then in the evening, they might have to do a story on, for example, nuclear power or perhaps the political situation in Japan at the moment. Freelance reporters of this type do a wide variety of things. Then there is the specialist in one area. They are particularly well-versed in some very, very obscure topic that may not be read in ordinary daily newspapers, but is wanted by specialist magazines and broadcast organizations. For example, people who are experts on COVID vaccinations or health issues or scientific issues, or people who can report and write very deeply about things like 19th century Japanese art or classical music or airplane technology, this kind of thing. So these types of freelance journalists you don't see as much in mainstream newspapers and magazines or on television, but they do make a very good living sometimes covering their specialty. Then there are book authors. Book authors get most of their income from book publications and sales. And here in Japan, all you have to do is go to Maruzen or to Kinokuniya, and you'll find a lot of books written by journalists who are mostly authors. And they concentrate, of course, on nonfiction stories. Some of them may occasionally write for their local newspaper. They might write op-ed columns, or they might even be an editor. More rarely, they are a reporter. Reporters are usually way too busy with their daytime jobs to write books, but some of them do. And then finally, there's the self-employed publisher. Over the last 5 or 10 years, this category of journalist has grown by leaps and bounds. I'm talking about here with people who have their own blogs, their own podcasts, and their own video sites, and they do their own journalism. And they do original research for nonfiction stories, and you can find these on pretty much every subject you can imagine. So that's my definition of what a journalist is. Now, who, though, is not considered a journalist? Well, people who write or broadcast stories that are only based on facts. Fiction can be based on fact, but unless it is purely factual, it's not journalism. It has to be 100% factual before it would be considered journalism. Then I would say people whose job it is to propagate or to convey the specific message of an organization. That organization can be government or business or some other form, but it is an organization, and the organization approves of the content in advance of the publication or the broadcast. And they very often, it will ignore facts or arguments that the organization doesn't want to appear. In other words, it's basically advertising. And that's the difference between journalism and advertising. And of course, journalists are not people who pass along information without independently confirming it's true. Just retweeting something that you heard or posting something that you saw on Facebook without checking to make sure it's accurate is not journalism. In fact, it could be fake news. So those are the kinds of people who are not journalists. In this profession in particular, you get a lot of people who want to be famous, or who want to be well known, or who want to make a difference, or who want to join the corridors of what they see as power. And as in any profession, there are good journalists and there are very bad journalists. But I want to talk about what all good journalists have in common. And in my opinion, they have the following things in common as people. First, they are very curious about a wide variety of things not necessarily related to each other. For example, my personal interests include Japanese politics, society, and energy policy, and I write about these things quite a lot. But I have completely non-related interests, such as European 20th century history, Celtic music and classical music, aviation and flying, British-style humor, American history, and current affairs not related to Japan. So I have a curiosity about a lot of things other than what I write about every day. And all good journalists I know are basically the same. All good journalists are good listeners. We think it's so simple. Listening, how hard can that be? You just keep your mouth shut and keep your ears open. Well, in fact, you have to learn how to listen carefully and intelligently, and this takes practice. And it means not only listening, but asking questions that show you understand and to move the conversation along. A lot of people think listening just means sitting still, keeping quiet, and listening to what the person says and not offering your own opinion or not helping the conversation. That is not good journalism. All journalists, good journalists, enjoy asking questions because they always want to learn something. You're not studying for a test. You're learning something new because it's fun, because you enjoy it, because you didn't know it before and you want to learn more. So if you don't really enjoy learning new things, then you will be a very bad journalist. All good journalists are careful observers of what is going on around them. They don't look at their smartphones. They don't constantly text their friends. They stop, look, and listen to the world around them. This sounds very simple, but in fact it is not. Today, coming on the train to Sapporo University, I noticed a lot of people on the subway staring at their iPhones and not paying attention to what was going on around them. This has become a major problem for your generation, but also for a lot of people, because the ability to concentrate has been reduced. And if you're going into journalism, you can't be looking at your cell phone or your iPhone or your smart pad or whatever all the time, because you won't understand what's happening right in front of your nose. And if you're not a careful observer, you're going to make mistakes in your reporting, and those mistakes could get you into very, very deep trouble. So you need to be a careful observer. And related to being a careful observer is the ability to focus. Journalists, good journalists, develop the ability to concentrate for long periods of time. And they are patient. They have the ability to read complicated, long documents as many times as needed to understand. Sure, on deadline, you don't always have as much time as you want, and you have to be able to read quickly and summarize the information accurately in a very short period of time. But in general, if you've got the ability to concentrate, a really good ability to concentrate, you know which parts are important and you know which parts are not important, and therefore it becomes easier. Nevertheless, if you have a short attention span, because you get bored, you don't want to read that book, you don't want to read that report, you don't want to look at that website because your eyes start moving and you start thinking about other things you would like to be doing, well, you're not going to be a good journalist because you're going to miss something important. And you won't have a complete understanding. And if you don't have a complete understanding, your readers or your listeners are not going to understand either. So all good journalists have the ability to concentrate. And this is crucial. All journalists double check or triple check the information that they receive. In the age of fake media and social media, where everything is speeded up and information flows faster than ever, this can be very, very difficult to do. But you must do it. You're a journalist. People are reading you because they trust you to get the facts across and to do an honest job. So you need to take the time, and you don't mindlessly tweet or pass off information that you're not sure of. And you certainly don't put that information into your stories. You're careful, and in journalism, the best thing that you can learn at the beginning is a very simple saying. And that saying is, when in doubt, leave it out. Which basically means if you are not sure of what you're putting into your story because you haven't checked it, or you're not able to check it, or you tried to check it but you just didn't have time, or the answer you got you didn't understand or you felt was incomplete, then leave it out. You can get it in later. So all journalists have a desire to tell a story. Journalism is basically storytelling, and storytelling is probably the oldest form of human communication there is. We have evidence that human beings were telling stories to each other tens of thousands of years ago. So if you are a journalist, your first desire should be to tell a story. It doesn't have to be on a particular subject. It can be whatever you want, but you need to tell a story with a beginning, a middle, and an end. So journalism is basically a large conversation, written down or broadcast with all sorts of people. So you want to make the conversation interesting and convincing by telling people a good story. Something that will make them laugh, something that will make them think, something that will make them sad, something that will make them angry, something that will make them thoughtful, something that will make them want to change something. That's good journalism. And related to that, all good journalists fight for the truth. And all good journalists fight against advertising and propaganda. It's not always easy. And even when their editors and publishers oppose them, they have to continue to fight for the truth. Bad journalists are group-oriented, and they make excellent salarymen in corporations. No doubt about that. But good journalists are very difficult to get along with, and they often disagree with their bosses because there's always arguments over what is truth. What is the truth of that story? What can we confirm? What have we double-checked or triple-checked? And all of those questions can be very, very emotional, and there can be strong differences of opinion on how to interpret the evidence or the story between the editor and the good journalist. So if the good journalist believes his or her version is the truth, then you got to fight for it, even though it may cause you personal problems with the people you work with. All good journalists have a sense of justice and a sense of compassion. Sometimes you're the only voice in the room that's saying something is wrong. You have to say it. You have to be the lone wolf. You have to be the nail that stands up. You might get hammered down, but you have to do it. Because what you're writing, what you're covering, if you know it's correct, if you know that you're right, if you feel that you're right, you have to be able to defend it. And to be able to defend it, you have to have a sense of why it is just. You also have to have a sense of compassion. Sometimes it's not about just writing the facts, but about showing compassion in your writing or journalism that tells us why this story matters to us. It can be about maybe somebody who's had hard times. It can be about a change that needs to be made in society. It can be about just a personal revelation about something that happened to somebody that you feel has something larger to say about life in general. All of these things require a good sense of compassion on the part of the journalist. Otherwise, all you're doing is doing unpassionate work, and your readers and your broadcasters will, and your broadcast audience will feel it. And then, of course, all journalists have a great sense of humor. I've been a journalist now for about 27 of the 34, well, actually 30 of the 34 years I've lived in Japan. The best journalists I've met, not only Japanese, but from all over the world, if this is the one thing that I would say they have in common, it's a great sense of humor. They know how to laugh, and they know how to make other people laugh. They understand that human beings are not perfect. People make mistakes. Politicians, bureaucrats, and business leaders don't tell the truth all of the time, or sometimes they just, again, make mistakes. They meant to tell the truth, but their information was wrong. And you just have to accept that that's the way things are. And you have to laugh about it. Great journalists understand that they too are going to make mistakes, no matter how hard they try, because there's always something important to the story that a journalist does not know and was not able to find out before the deadline came. This is just the way journalism works. Journalism is often tense, serious, heartbreaking, and exhausting. It's very easy to burn out. It's very easy to become negative. It's very easy to become pessimistic about the things that you see. But having a good sense of humor about the fact that people are not perfect, and sometimes life can be absurd, this will help keep you sane. And sadly, I have known a number of journalists over the years who have suffered from depression or anxiety or other physical or mental problems because the stress of the job just got to them. And very often, in my opinion, one possible reason for their illness was the fact they didn't have the kind of humor, this kind of sense of humor that's needed to do the job that they were doing. So again, great journalists have a great sense of humor. When we become journalists, we very often say we're going to get the story. We want to scoop everybody else. We want to be the first reporter to get a really important story. And if we do that, that makes us great journalists. And there's something to be said for that within the context of a media organization. If you're working for a media organization, you want to scoop somebody else. But in English, people often say of journalism, it's the story of what happened. That's wrong. It's not the story of what happened. It's a story. Just one of many possible versions of what happened, but it's told from the individual journalist's point of view. There's a very famous classic Japanese film called Rashomon, which tells a story from many different angles, and there are many Hollywood films that do the same thing. And that's sort of what journalism is. It's one story from one angle, and it's factually accurate, and it's truthful, but it may not be the whole story. In fact, it may not be the most important version of that story. But that's the limitation of journalism. We tell a story of what happened, not the entire story of what happened. So by now you're probably thinking, wow, that's a lot of things that I need to do to be a good journalist. Perhaps some of you are thinking it's too difficult, or perhaps you're thinking that I'm not quite sure how to go about even trying to become a good journalist. Well, here are some basic questions that you all, as students, are going to have to face in the coming years. You're going to have to ask yourselves these questions if you do decide to pursue a career as a journalist as opposed to somebody who wants to work in media. Again, as I explained earlier, that's a different situation. But first of all, I think the question that everybody is asking today is, does print media have a future? Probably very few of you subscribe to an old-fashioned paper newspaper, and perhaps very few of you buy old-fashioned paper news magazines. Around the world, there's a lot of people who say paper, print, is dead. It's gone. It's the era before us. It's 20th century media, and that the digital age has arrived, and it will always be here. The digital age will certainly always be with us, but it will continue to evolve. About 100 years ago, when radio first became commercially available, a lot of people said radio was going to replace newspapers and magazines. That didn't prove to be the case. Then about 70 years ago, television really became popular among a large group of people, and people started saying television was going to kill print media, that everybody would be watching television and that newspapers and magazines would simply stop publishing. That didn't turn out to be the case. About 30 years ago, when the internet first really got going, there was a whole generation of people who said, with the digital age, with the internet age, print media is dead. By 2020, you won't be able to buy print newspapers or magazines anymore. Well, that hasn't turned out to be the case either. Certainly print media has changed, but as to the question, does print media have a future, especially if you're going to be a journalist? Well, we have more print media today than at any time in history. What has changed over the past 30 years is the print medium. We've gone from paper mostly to cyberspace, print to digital. However, the basic writing skills that print media in long ago paper form required remain just as important today as they always have been. So yes, not only does print media have a future, it's going to remain critical to success in all media forms, print or otherwise. So you need to keep that in mind. However, let's say that you don't really want to become a print journalist. Let's say you're in love with cameras and video journalism, and you want to become a video journalist. So of course, you're going to ask, well, how important is it really to be able to write in a print media form if my job or if my type of journalism is broadcast journalism? Well, it's extremely critical, and there are three basic reasons. First, for broadcast media, you need to be able to write a script for your on-camera shots and voiceovers that is crisp, clear, and concise, and will make complicated material and events easy for your viewers to understand and follow. If you're a good writer, in the old-fashioned print tradition, this is much easier. Second, if you have a collection of sounds and images with no context, what you've got is simple entertainment that seeks an emotional reaction only from the audience. However, a well-written script is the basis of great video journalism, in my opinion, and great video journalism tries to tell a story that is not only emotional, but also thoughtful. And of course, even if you're going to become a video journalist, you still need to do a lot of writing. In particular, video pre-production, setting up shots, contacting sources, talking to them beforehand, involves a lot of complicated negotiations to appear on camera, and there are other arrangements as well. And those negotiations go much better with good writing. The next question that a lot of people always ask is, okay, I think I do want to become a journalist, but if I get a job, should I apply for a job with a major media group, a major national newspaper, or a major national broadcaster? What should I do? Well, with any major media group here in Japan or elsewhere, there are advantages and disadvantages for young journalists like yourselves. Some advantages. Well, the most obvious one is probably job security. Since you've got a full-time job, however, you may not be assigned to the editorial department. So, of course, you're part of a team in a major media group, and you'll be taught the basic elements of journalism and how to fact-check carefully. Again, though, there are some disadvantages. One is, sure, you've got a full-time job in media, but you may not be a journalist. To become a journalist in a major media organization, or even a reporter, is a very, very competitive process. And it doesn't always mean that the best journalist or the best writer or the best videographer gets the job. Sometimes it comes down to politics, sometimes it comes down to connections, sometimes it comes down to luck. So you might get a job in media, but you may not get the job you really wanted as a journalist. So that means you won't get the ability to broadcast or write stories. Now, another route that some people take is freelance work. And freelance journalism is booming today. There are a lot of jobs out there. You have to know where to look, and you need contacts. But freelance work has some good news and bad news. The good news of being a freelancer is that you have much more freedom to write or broadcast the kind of stories that you want. Much more freedom. The bad news is you've got to find an editor at a publication or a producer at a broadcast station who will pay you good money for your work. So there are many poor freelance journalists out there, although there are many successful ones as well. And the very successful ones make much more money than journalists working at major media outlets make. They don't have the same job security, perhaps, but they're making a lot more money. So I've asked a number of freelance journalist friends over the years, how do you become successful? How do you go from knowing nobody to becoming financially successful as a freelance journalist? Well, effort plus personability plus knowledge plus ability and connections equals a financially successful freelancer. Effort means effort at being a good writer, being a good videographer. Personability means basically being someone who gets along with all different types of people, even if you personally don't like them or disagree with them. In other words, a diplomat. Knowledge. You've got to have a certain amount of knowledge. This is true. And when you're a young student, it can be kind of difficult at times because you're competing against older freelance journalists who do have more knowledge. But you can develop that specialty as you go. Ability. Ability means several things. First, it means the basic ability to tell a story well with a good beginning, a good middle, and a good end. But it also means a professional ability to be competent and to be courteous. That means you are always on time. That means you always make the deadline. That means you are always thinking ahead and planning ahead in case things go wrong. And it means also being able to know when to say no to a certain project if it doesn't meet your standards. You have to be able to say no to work that does not pay you well or a situation you are not personally comfortable with. And that requires a certain kind of moral ability. And of course, if you've got effort and if you've got personability and you've got some knowledge and you've got some ability, eventually you'll make the connections that you need. But connections do take some time in the beginning, but once they're made and once that you show that you do have the ability, you do have the knowledge, you are a personable person, and you are making a great effort, then that opens you up to more connections and it becomes easier as you go along. And that's what most freelance people who are successful doing freelance work have told me is the secret to their success. Some of you may be looking at special courses. You're thinking, I'm in high school or I'm in college. Maybe I'll go to college and take some courses in journalism or writing, or I'm now at university. Maybe I should go to a journalism school here in Japan or overseas first for a couple of years in order to stand a better chance of getting a job as a professional journalist. So you're asking, do you need to take special courses? And my answer is no, you do not. Many journalists I know have no special training and had no special training when they were in high school or college in either journalism or journalism techniques. What they did have was a college major that they enjoyed, and they loved to read about a lot of things that were not related to that major. So economics majors would read books on history, politics, or art. Physics majors would read books on music or philosophy. And of course, everybody kept up to date with current events. They wanted to know what was happening in the world around them. So I think that if you've got this, then probably those special courses are an option that you might want to consider, but they are not absolutely necessary to get a full-time job or even a freelance job as a professional journalist once you have graduated from school. Now, what about journalism school? I talk to a lot of college students in particular about this subject, and it seems that in their senior years of university, or perhaps 1 year, 2 years after graduation, when they're out in the real world working part-time jobs, they start looking at journalism schools, especially abroad, although there are some journalism schools here in Japan now as well. They look at the journalism schools with the hope that if they go, they'll learn how to do journalism and they'll make the contacts to get a high-paying job at a major media organization. There's nothing wrong with that. But in the real world, journalism school has advantages and disadvantages in the field of journalism. Let me go through some of the advantages first. I think a big advantage, especially if you are unsure of your own writing ability, is that you learn basic techniques of researching, writing, and editing print and broadcast media reports at an international standard that is widely used by major newspapers and television stations around the world. So you're kind of learning a standard form of how to research, write, edit, and broadcast. Just as importantly, you're learning some basic principles about journalism ethics, ideals, and practices that are part of the corporate media culture in many countries, including Japan. Sometimes it's easier to say, well, those journalism ethics don't really apply to my country or to my situation or to the type of thing I want to do. That may be, but sometimes, especially ethics and ideal classes, can help you prevent possible legal problems. And I've found that having a basic understanding of what journalism ethics are, whether you get them in journalism school or not, in the practical world helps avoid trouble with your editors. And then finally, yes, connections. The old boy or old girl network from journalism school can help you open doors to major media organizations that probably otherwise would not listen to you. So those are some advantages. Of course, there are some disadvantages as well, and I need to mention those. First, the style of writing that journalism school teaches might not be suitable for the particular print or broadcast media that you work for or want to work for. Very often, people learn one standard in journalism school, and then they are hired by a company, and the company says, all of that's well and good, great, that's fine that you learned such and such in college or in journalism school. However, this is how we do things. And you basically have to start over and adjust to their ethics, their ideals, their way of writing and broadcast that might be very different from what you learned in journalism school. And of course, some of the principles and ethics still being taught in journalism school today may be seen in some media firms as outdated in the media age. And that's partially true. Some schools may offer courses on media technology, on digital technology, yes, but very often the arguments about using digital technology to tell a journalism story are based on ethical ideas that are perhaps somewhat out of date now. That's nobody's fault. Digital technology is changing very, very rapidly, and it's very difficult for everybody to keep up on what is considered ethical and what is considered not ethical when writing reports in the digital age. And then, of course, at the end of the day, as I have been saying, good journalism is about the ability to deliver good, truthful stories as quickly as possible. You don't need J school for that. If you're a good writer, if you're a good researcher, if you like to tell a story, if you keep up on current events, you too can be a good journalist. So, in conclusion, I want to leave you with the following thoughts. First, if you want to go into journalism, I think that you must love telling truthful stories with a beginning, a middle, and an end in order to become a good journalist. The media, whether it's paper, radio, television, the internet, or social media, through which your story is told is of lesser importance. It's of secondary importance. It's all about the story, and it's all about the story's truthfulness and accuracy. Second, many people think journalism is easy. Hey, I've been writing since I was an elementary school student. What could be easier? And many people think it's glamorous and exciting. Wow, I get to meet famous politicians or famous movie stars or music celebrities. Yeah, that's part of it sometimes, but most of the time, it's not easy. It requires a lot of things that I've been talking about: concentration, focus, arguing over small words, deciding whether this word or that word is appropriate, and deciding whether or not to use this photo, or use this scene or not that scene. Confirming things. Did the person say October or August? Did she say 1,500 or 15,000? So all of these things are part of what is very good journalism. And of course, that means that good journalism is, in fact, sometimes, if not often, difficult and often boring. I have spent many, many, many hours very bored at what I've been doing to prepare for a story. But the fact of the matter is, if I didn't do that preparation, I wouldn't be telling you a truthful story. And I don't want to do that, and neither should you. And of course, journalism can be dangerous at times, especially if you're covering a war zone, but just in daily life. Sometimes things come up and that are unexpected. You don't have to cover a riot. You don't have to cover a war. Sometimes you might get threatened with a lawsuit, or sometimes somebody might attack you personally on social media or send a threatening letter. That's part of the territory, and you need to be mentally prepared and psychologically prepared to handle it. And then, of course, this is, I think, one of the most important things to remember. Journalists generally see themselves as outsiders to power, and they enjoy confronting it and asking questions of it and poking it and arguing with it. People who want nothing more than harmonious relations with others and don't really want to question powerful people because it's embarrassing or frightening, they should not become journalists. You've got to ask the questions. You have to stand up and ask the question, even though everybody else in the room is telling you to sit down, even though the officials clearly don't want to answer your question, even though the person you are addressing the question to is unhappy and maybe starts yelling in anger or bursts out crying in tears or threatens a lawsuit, or in very rare cases, in my experience at least, physically tries to attack you. So you've got to go through with this. And if you are afraid to question powerful people, then you should probably think about becoming a journalist, because otherwise all you really are is just a secretary to people in power. And if you want to do that, there is nothing wrong with that, but go into advertising, because if nothing else, it pays a lot more money. So I've given you what I think are some of the things that if you want to go into journalism now, you need to be thinking about. My sense is that over the past few years, universities in particular have emphasized the media aspects of journalism, and playing with social media, playing with cameras, playing with all the new digital technology is perfectly fine. You do need to learn how to do that. But remember, the technology is going to change. And by the time those of you who are at Hokkaido International School are graduating university, the technology will have changed again. And there will be some new social media form or some new platform that you're going to have to learn. So you have a choice. You can spend all of your time constantly learning how to deal with technology, or you can learn the basics of reading and researching and editing and writing good stories with a good beginning, middle, and end. That's stories that use clear and concise language and that are emotional and thoughtful. And you can take those skills and apply them to whatever media technology happens to be prevalent in a few years' time. I've been a journalist now for, again, about 30 of the last 34 years, and I've seen so many changes to the technology, what I was doing 30 years ago just simply doesn't exist anymore in terms of technology, except maybe in museums. And I've also seen a lot of people come and go in journalism, and generally the successful ones love to tell stories and want to tell the truth as they see it. And they believe that their opinions are important. You all, as the next generation, your opinions are very important. And please, if you are thinking about a career in journalism, make sure that you get your views on the truth out, because all of us are ignorant. All of us do not understand what the future may bring, but we need as many voices as possible in order to make sense of a very confused world. And that's a good thing, because the more voices we have, the better decisions we can make. So with that, I'm going to conclude in English, and I will just briefly go through, if I may, in Japanese, what I talked about. So those of you who couldn't follow along in the English can now listen in. And if you want to listen in to the Japanese, you're more than welcome to do so. I'll go back to the beginning and just give a very, very brief summary of what I said. まず、これはジャーナリズムとかメディアのことについてまず意味しなければなりません。ジャーナリズムということはやはり観察したりとかインタビューしたりとか研究したりとかいろいろ活動で話作ることなんです。で基本的にこれは話をすることです。で逆にメディアということはメディアは技術ということで技術というのは紙アナログとかデジタル放送とかサイバースペース。だからたくさんの方はメディアに働いてます。ところがジャーナリストという方はメディアに入っているジャーナリストは比較的に少ないです。それからジャーナリストというものは何でしょうか。いくつかの意味があるんですが、僕から見ると大体5つの項目です。まず正社員のニュースリポーターとかあるいはエディター編集の方とかそれから正社員のライターとか編集の方とかフィーチャーというものは特集記事でニュースリポーターは毎日短い原稿を出している方特集記事を書く方は毎日じゃなくて定期的に例えば週1回、2回とか背景のある記事を出している。それからフリーランスの記者、あるいはフリーランスのエディター。このような方はもう数多くいるんですが、いろんな課題を取材している方と、あるいは特別な知識を持っている方で、一つか二つのジャンルを、取材している方はいます。それから本を書く人です。本を書く人のほとんどの収入はもちろん本の販売。ところが時々新聞のために社説とかあるいは、原稿を出してるんですがあとは自分のメディアを持っている方とか、自分の出版社とかこういうような方は自分のブログとかポッドキャストとかビデオサイトを持っている方で自分で情報収集研究とかいろいろ活動してノンフィクションの話を作ります。それからジャーナリストという方はいろいろいるんですが、ジャーナリストじゃない人はどういう方なのかとか、まずもしかしたら、原稿を書いたりとか放送したりする方はその話は事実を基づいている話ということですが、事実を基づいている話はそれはジャーナリズムじゃない。ジャーナリズムということは 100% はファクト、100% は事実です。事実を基づいて原稿を書いている方はどちらかというと広告会社とかあるいはプロパガンダ。もしかしたらインターネットとかソーシャルメディアを通してリツイートとか情報を転送したりしている方はそれはジャーナリズムじゃないです。それからいいジャーナリストはどういうこと、どういう方とかそれはちょっと紹介しますが、 まずいろんなことは知りたい。知らないことはもっともっと知りたい。そういう野心的な意識を持っている方はいいジャーナリスト。それからちゃんと人の話を聞いている方はいいジャーナリストです。これはどうしても練習しなければならない。よく聞くのは、それはただ聞いてるだけじゃなくて、会話の途中でどうやって話のやり取り、話の流れに進むかとか、それがgood listener とかよく聞く人です。それからいいジャーナリストはいつも質問を聞くのは大好きです。というのはいつも新しいことを学びたい。それから全てのいいジャーナリストは周りに何があるのかよく観察している、よく考えている。スマートフォンとかスマートパッドしか見えないとか、目の前のことは気づかない人はいいジャーナリストにならない。それから集中力ということ、特に長期的に集中力がある方。ジャーナリズムではいくつかの資料とかいくつかの情報はもうバーッと入ってきたら、それを読まなければならない。じっと読まないと事実のジャーナリズムはできない。だから我慢力が大切です。話をするのにすごい希望が高いという方はいいジャーナリストです。別に課題とかも何でもいいんですが、やっぱりこういうことを話したい、こういうことは伝えたいとか、そういうような方は非常に熱心が強いならいいジャーナリストになります。基本的にジャーナリズムは大きな会話です。それから全てのいいジャーナリストの方は事実のために戦います。時々自分の会社の中にも自分のボス、編集者とか出版は自分の努力、自分の取り組みを反対している。反対していることは当たり前です。ところが悪いジャーナリストの方が、わかりました。じゃあ従います。それは悪いジャーナリスト。いいジャーナリストは、いや、違います。ダメです。とか、よく反論したり、よく反発したりしてます。それはいいジャーナリスト。いいジャーナリストの方は何が正しい、何が正しくないとか、そういう判断力が強い。同情とか、人の気持ちはよくわかる。もしかしたらあなただけこういうことが正しいと確信すれば、じゃあそういうようなことを伝わなければならない。それから時々事実を書く、事実を報道することだけじゃなくて、自分の原稿の中にはなんでこんな問題は大切とか感動させるための表現力も必要です。それから sense of humor。なんか笑いやすいジャーナリストの方はいいジャーナリストです。日々にはいろいろ苦しいことはあるんです。それから自分の取材で世界とかもいろんな問題は分かるようになって、やっぱりうつ病まで落ち込むのは珍しくないんです。ジャーナリズム界では。ただ良いジャーナリストだったら、やっぱり人間は完璧じゃないです。人間はどのぐらい努力しても間違えてしまう。それは当たり前です。それは当然だから、笑うしかない。で、こういうような笑うしかない態度だったら、いいジャーナリストになることができる。笑うしかない態度をできない人だったら、結局いろいろ精神的な問題が出てくると思います。それから英語ではジャーナリズムはそういう起こった話です。ところがジャーナリズムは起こった話の一種だけです。いろんな局面から判断できる、いろんな局面から報道できますが、あなたは一人のジャーナリストとしては自分の観点から報道している話です。とか、そういうことを分かればいいジャーナリストになると思います。学生たちとしてはこれからジャーナリズム業界に入るかどうか、多分いろいろ悩んでるんですが、でもその入る前に自分自身はいろんな質問聞かないとダメです。まずプリントメディア、要するに紙で新聞のメディアは将来あるのかとか、 私から見ると将来があると思います。なぜかというと、紙のメディアの書き方とか、あるいは考え方とか、これは何のデジタルテクノロジーでも適用できます。基本的によく書くことは、それはデジタルテクノロジーでも紙のメディアではもう大事です。大事というか重要です。だからそれは変わらないと思う。あとはビデオジャーナリズムにはよく書くことは大事ですか？大事です。まずやっぱり原文を書くのにやっぱりよく書かないとダメです。というのはビデオジャーナリズムだったら撮影だけだったらイメージだけだったら自分の見てる人たちはわかんない。なんであんなイメージ、なんでこんな場面とかでよく書けばそれはもっと分かりやすいイメージを伝えることができます。ビデオプリプロダクション、要するにビデオを作る前にいろいろ準備が必要です。例えば情報数字とかある方とインターネットでインタビューの時間とかインタビューはまず説得しないといけない。ということでちゃんと書けばそれは説得力はもっと強くなるし、結局もっといいビデオリポートにできます。それからもしかしたら卒業したら大手メディアに就職活動すればいいかと思ってるんですが、僕から見るといいところ悪いところはもうあるんですが、大手メディアに入ろうとしている人には。いいところとしてはもちろん入ったらそのメディア自体は倒産する可能性は非常に低い。特に正社員たちの方が結構確保されている仕事ある。しかし大手メディアに入ったらもしかしたらジャーナリズムじゃなくてやっぱりジャーナリズムじゃない部に所属される。ということでジャーナリストになりたいだったら機会はない。もちろん大手メディアに入ったらチームとか、いろんな方先輩後輩とかいるから基本的にジャーナリズムの理論とかジャーナリズムのやり方は教えてもらいます。しかし本当に自分でできるとか自分でする機会は少ないです。だからそれはもう悪いところだと思う。あとはフリーランスですが、フリーランスの方がいくつかのことがまず大事ですが、努力とか、外交力とか知識とか能力とか、あとは人脈、コネとか、特に若い人たちにとっては難しいみたいんですが、ところがあったらもう財政的に成功なフリーランスジャーナリストになると思う。で、今のところは大学生としてあるいは高校生として特別な講座を取ればいいのかとかもしかしたら考えているんですが、僕から見ると別にプロフェッショナルとかジャーナリストになるために今の段階では特別な講座取らなくてもいいんです。ところが書くことは好きとか撮影すること好きとか何よりも話とか物語を作ることは大好きなことは前提です。特に現代の社会について。ジャーナリズムスクールとか、海外とか国内のいくつかのジャーナリズムスクールがあるんですが、あれもいいところ悪いところですが、基本的にいいところとしては国際基準のことを勉強できます。ジャーナリズムのやり方だけじゃなくてジャーナリズムの理論。ところが悪いところですが、もしかしたらジャーナリズムスクールを卒業すれば就職活動はしにくいかもしれません。というのは自分の入ったメディア団体の方がジャーナリズムスクールで習ったことは構いませんですが、うちの会社はこういうふうにやりますとか言われて。だからまとめとしてはいいジャーナリストになるためにやはり事実上の話を作るとか伝えることは重要と、あるいは熱心がある方はいいジャーナリスト。どういうメディアの種類、紙、ラジオ、テレビ、インターネット、ソーシャルメディア、どういうメディアを通してあなたの話が伝われているのか、それは実際にそんなに大切じゃないです。話は大切です。技術はそこまで大切じゃないです。で、たくさんの方はジャーナリズムは簡単じゃないですか。僕は小学生以降はずっと書いたりとか キャメラやったりしてるんですが、たくさんの人は確かにそう思ってる。あるいはなんか刺激的とか、もう面白い、有名人あったりとか、セレブリティとかインタビューしたりとか、一部そういう仕事は確かにあります。ところが簡単なことは全くないと思います。いいジャーナリズムをするために時間がかかる、退屈、細かい、たくさんある。で、時々危険もあります。それから最後に、どんな方はジャーナリストになろうとしているのが、僕の経験から見ますと、ジャーナリストの方は社会からちょっと外れている方なんです。権力と距離がある方の方が良いジャーナリスト。で、権利とか、例えば政府とか企業とかに反論することは好きです。事実を探すために丁寧にとかよくやり取りすることは無理といいジャーナリストは知ってる。時々激しくとか強制的に質問したりとかやらないといけない。だからある方はいや僕は平和な生活とかやりたいだけとかで、やっぱり偉い人にそういう厳しく言いたくないとか、難しい質問はやる気がないとか、そういうような方はやっぱりジャーナリストにならない方がいいと思いますが、ところがもしかしたらやっぱり事実は大事です。やはり何が正しい、何が正しくないとか、社会に伝わらないとやっぱり将来はないというそこまでの熱心が強い人だったら多分いいジャーナリストになることできるけど、皆さんこれからどういう将来なのかとかわからないことはよくわかりますが、ジャーナリズムは技術的にいろいろ変わってきましたですが、基本は変わってないと思う。真実を求めることは何よりも大事です。じゃあこれから頑張ってください。今日ご清聴ありがとうございました。